He left her standing alone at the altar, not abandoned before the vows, after them. The ink on the marriage certificate was barely dry when Vincent Callahan straightened his cufflinks, nodded once at the officiant, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. No first dance, no toast, no hand extended to the woman who had just become his wife in front of 200 witnesses. Charlotte Hayes stood in the center of that gilded room in her ivory dress, holding a bouquet of white peonies, watching the doors swing shut behind a man who had already forgotten she existed. The guests went silent. Eleanor Callahan, 81 years old and seated in the front row with oxygen-thin breath and shaking hands, closed her eyes. She had asked for one thing. One thing in what she knew were her remaining years, and her grandson had fulfilled the letter of that request while destroying its entire soul. If that had been you standing in that ballroom, what would you have done? If you're new here, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens inside the Callahan mansion over the next 8 months will shake you to your core. Hit the like button and drop a comment with your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Ite. The morning of the wedding, Charlotte Hayes ironed her own dress. That detail would seem small to anyone who didn't know her situation. But the Callahan household had 12 full-time staff members, a personal stylist on retainer, and a florist who had arrived at dawn to fill 3 floors of the mansion with white roses and eucalyptus. Charlotte had access to all of it. She used none of it. She set up her travel iron on the writing desk in the guest room. The guest room, because no one had thought to arrange anything else, and worked the wrinkles out of her ivory gown herself, the way she'd been handling things her entire adult life. Her mother had called twice that morning. Charlotte let both calls go to voicemail. She already knew what her mother would say, that this was a mistake, that marrying a man she barely knew, a man whose name carried weight in rooms Charlotte had never been invited into, was the kind of decision that couldn't be undone. Her mother wasn't wrong. But her mother also hadn't spent the last 3 years watching Eleanor Callahan sit alone by the window of St. Catherine's assisted living, talking to a photograph of her late husband like he might eventually answer. Charlotte had. She'd started volunteering at St. Catherine's during her second year as a junior professor at Columbia, part of a community engagement initiative that most of her colleagues treated as a checkbox, and she'd treated as an actual commitment. Eleanor had been sitting in the common room that first Tuesday afternoon, surrounded by people who spoke to her in the slow, loud, careful voice people reserved for the very old and the very fragile. Eleanor had hated it visibly. She'd been reading a book on Hudson River landscapes with her reading glasses halfway down her nose, and when Charlotte had sat across from her and asked what she was reading, Eleanor had looked up with an expression of pure, startled relief. That had been 3 years ago. By the second year, Charlotte spent 2 afternoons a week at St. Catherine's, and most of those afternoons were spent with Eleanor. They argued about architecture. They disagreed about which decade of American painting had mattered most. Eleanor had opinions the way other people had furniture. Heavy, permanent, arranged exactly where she wanted them. Charlotte loved that about her. She loved that Eleanor never softened an observation to spare feelings, and never expected Charlotte to soften hers either. When Eleanor had first mentioned Vincent, it was in passing. Her grandson. Runs the family business. 34. Never married. Charlotte had noted it the way you noted weather. Acknowledged, filed away, moved on. When Eleanor had asked Charlotte to consider meeting him, Charlotte had been gentle but clear. She wasn't looking for an introduction. When Eleanor had taken her hand one October afternoon and said, with the particular directness of a woman who understood exactly how much time she had left, that she needed to see Vincent settled before she died. Really settled, not just managed. Charlotte had felt the ground shift slightly under her feet. She'd said she would think about it. She'd thought about it for 6 weeks. The 3 letters she wrote during those 6 weeks, declining, explaining, apologizing, were never sent. Each time she sat down to finish one, she thought about Eleanor's face when she talked about Vincent, not the pride, which was there and genuine. Something older than pride, something that looked to Charlotte's eye like grief for a boy who had learned to become a fortress so young that he'd forgotten there was a person inside. Charlotte was an art history professor. She studied things that had been walled off and forgotten. She had professional sympathy for that condition. She had mailed nothing. She had, instead, agreed to one dinner. The dinner had lasted 47 minutes. Vincent Callahan had arrived 8 minutes late, apologized without looking at her, ordered without asking what she preferred, and spent the majority of the meal checking his phone under the table with the practiced subtlety of someone who didn't think the person across from him was paying attention. Charlotte had been paying close attention. She'd noted the tension in his jaw that never fully released, the way he scanned the room every few minutes with the automatic vigilance of a man who had learned young that comfort was a vulnerability. She'd noted that he was considerably more attractive in person than Eleanor's photograph suggested, which she'd filed away as irrelevant. At the 47-minute mark, his phone had buzzed visibly on the table. He'd looked at it, then at her, and said, "I need to go handle something." Charlotte had nodded. He'd stood, dropped a credit card on the table without asking for the check, and said, "Eleanor speaks highly of you." "She speaks highly of you too," Charlotte had said. Something had flickered across his face then. Not warmth, exactly. Something more complicated, like a word in a language he'd mostly forgotten. He'd left. Charlotte had finished her wine, paid the bill herself. She had a principle about that. And walked home through November rain thinking that Eleanor loved this man in the desperate, helpless way you loved someone you'd watched damage themselves for years and couldn't reach. She understood that kind of love. She didn't want to marry into it. But Eleanor was 81 and her lungs were worsening, and the one thing she'd asked for in what everyone could see were her final years was to die knowing Vincent had someone. Charlotte had agreed to the wedding 5 weeks later. She'd written one more letter that she didn't send. The ceremony itself was held at Callahan Estate in the Hudson Valley on a Saturday in late April, with 200 guests who all seemed to know each other, and approximately none of whom knew Charlotte except through the brief formal introduction in the wedding program. She had 3 colleagues from Columbia in the 4th row, who she'd invited mostly because the idea of standing at an altar in front of a room full of strangers had struck her as too bleak to endure entirely alone. Vincent had been at the altar when she walked in. She'd watched him watch her approach, and she'd seen the exact moment he made a decision about her. It happened fast. 2, maybe 3 seconds. His eyes had moved from her face to the assembled guests to Eleanor seated in the front row, and then back to some middle distance slightly above Charlotte's left shoulder, and something in his expression had settled into place like a lock engaging. Whatever he'd been deciding, he'd decided it. The vows were short. His voice was steady and said nothing. The officiant pronounced them married. Vincent had signed the certificate, shaken the officiant's hand, exchanged a brief word with his attorney, at his own wedding, and walked out. Charlotte had stood in the ballroom for 4 minutes before Eleanor's aide, Maria, had quietly appeared at her elbow and said, "Mrs. Callahan, can I get you anything?" Mrs. Callahan. Charlotte had looked at the doors through which her husband had disappeared and understood, with the particular clarity that arrived after decisions became permanent, exactly what she'd agreed to. "Water," she'd said. "Thank you, Maria." Well, the Callahan mansion sat on 11 acres in Westchester, an hour north of the city. It had 14 rooms, a library that Eleanor had built out over 40 years, a kitchen that smelled of rosemary and old wood, and a staff of 6 full-time household employees who had all worked there long enough to have their own complex ecosystem of loyalty and affection. By the second week of living there, Charlotte understood that the mansion itself was a kind of character, that the house had its own emotional climate, its own grief and warmth layered into the walls. Vincent was not there most of the time. When he was there, he was not present in any meaningful sense. He moved through the kitchen in the morning without looking up, poured his own coffee before the staff could offer, read something on his phone, and was gone before Charlotte finished her first cup. She heard him come in late on the nights he came home at all, sometimes past midnight, sometimes later, footsteps on the stairs that passed her door without hesitation. He had not suggested they share a room. He had not suggested anything. He had made it clear through pure consistent absence that the marriage was a document and nothing more. Charlotte had known this was coming. She had agreed to it, technically speaking. She had not known how much the technicality would cost. She started leaving breakfast on the table anyway. Not because she expected him to eat it, more because she was a person who needed to do something with her hands in the morning, who cooked when she was processing difficult feelings, who had grown up in a household where food was the primary language of care and hadn't yet figured out how to stop speaking it. She made enough for two, or sometimes the second portion was there when she left for the university. Sometimes it wasn't. She never asked. She left notes occasionally. Small things. A department meeting had run long, so she'd be late for dinner. She'd found an interesting article about Hudson River restoration he might find relevant, given... She wasn't sure given what, but Eleanor had mentioned he cared about the valley. She'd borrowed a book from the library and would return it. Nothing that required a response. Everything that quietly hoped for one. The notes were never acknowledged. She told herself this was fine, that she had agreed to a practical arrangement, that she was a 30-year-old woman with a research position at one of the best universities in the country and a book manuscript in progress, and more than enough to fill her life without requiring the emotional participation of a man who had made his terms clear before the ink dried on the marriage license. She told herself this convincingly enough to get through most days. It was the evenings that were harder. The mansion at night was a different place. The staff went home. Eleanor was asleep by 9. The rooms filled with a particular quality of quiet that Charlotte could only describe as the silence of things that had been waiting a long time. She'd sit in the library with her work spread across the reading table and the lamp making a warm circle against the dark, and some part of her would register the size of the house around her, all those rooms, all that silence, all that space between herself and another living person. She started leaving the porch light on. Not for any particular reason she'd have been able to articulate to anyone who asked. It just felt wrong to let the house go completely dark. It felt like giving up on something she hadn't consciously decided to give up on yet. 5 weeks after moving in, she was introduced to the rest of the Callahan family at a Sunday dinner that Eleanor had orchestrated with the meticulous determination of a general planning a campaign. There were cousins, 4 of them, ranging in age from 19 to 30, and 2 uncles whose relationship to the family business. Charlotte understood to be significant, and whose actual functions she understood to be none of her business. There were wives and girlfriends who assessed Charlotte with the specific calibrated attention of women who had learned to read rooms quickly. Vincent sat at the head of the table and spoke mainly to his uncles. Charlotte sat beside him and spoke mainly to a 19-year-old cousin named Danny, who was studying environmental science at NYU and had deeply passionate opinions about watershed management that Charlotte found, to her genuine surprise, completely engaging. By the end of dinner, she'd recommended 3 papers, and Danny had her email address and was looking at her with the open admiration of someone who had not expected to meet an adult at this table who took his interests seriously. On the drive home, Vincent had been silent for 20 minutes before saying, without looking away from the road, "Danny doesn't normally talk that much." "He's interested in important things," Charlotte said. "He just needs someone to tell him that." Vincent had said nothing else, but she'd noticed, she was always noticing, that something in his grip on the steering wheel had shifted, slightly less tight. A small thing. Almost certainly nothing. She filed it away anyway. She was still in those early weeks paying attention to small things, still watching for the spaces where Vincent Callahan might be someone other than the locked room he presented. Still believing, with the stubborn empirical optimism that had made her good at her work, that the evidence she needed was somewhere in there if she kept looking. She hadn't yet learned that some people chose their walls. She hadn't yet learned that watching for spaces in someone else's defenses, when they never watch for spaces in yours, was a way of slowly disappearing. She wouldn't understand that until much later. For now, she went home, climbed the stairs to her room, turned off the lamp on her nightstand, and lay in the dark listening to the house settle around her while somewhere in this same building, her husband slept in his own room behind his own closed door, as far from her as he'd been on the night before their wedding, as far as he'd been at the altar, as far as he'd apparently decided to remain. The porch light stayed on. For now, it stayed on. 8 months is a long time to leave a light on for someone who never comes home looking for it. Charlotte understood this the way you understood most hard things. Not all at once, but in accumulation. One morning, she stood at the kitchen counter waiting for the coffee to finish and realized she had positioned herself at an angle that gave her a clear view of the doorway, and that she had been doing this every morning without acknowledging it, and that Vincent had not once walked through that doorway in the morning and looked toward her first. He looked at his phone. He looked at the window. He looked at the counter where his mug sat. He looked everywhere with the practiced efficiency of a man who had organized his attention to exclude her entirely. And she had been standing at that particular angle, at that particular counter, for 8 months, waiting for the morning. He looked at the doorway first. She moved to the other side of the kitchen and poured her coffee facing the window. It was a Tuesday in December, 4 days before Christmas, and the grounds outside were pale with frost that hadn't burned off yet. The trees along the east fence had lost everything. Charlotte watched them and drank her coffee and did not position herself to be seen by anyone. She did not leave breakfast on the table that morning. She also did not leave a note. These were small decisions. She did not make them dramatically. She made them the way you make decisions that have been waiting long enough, quietly, without ceremony, because the moment for ceremony had passed and nobody had shown up for it anyway. She rinsed her mug, picked up her bag, and went to work. Vincent came downstairs 14 minutes later to an empty kitchen and a table that had nothing on it and felt, for approximately 3 seconds, something he couldn't name before his phone rang, and he answered it, and the sensation was gone. The Callahan family Christmas gathering happened on the 23rd, because the 25th was reserved for whatever individual arrangements each branch of the family preferred, and the 23rd was Eleanor's day, had been for 30 years, and Eleanor's days were not negotiated. Charlotte had spent 2 evenings making a fig and walnut tart from a recipe she'd found in a 1960s Italian cookbook that Eleanor had mentioned offhandedly in October. She hadn't told anyone she was making it. She'd made it because Eleanor had said, in passing, that her mother used to make something similar, and because Charlotte was constitutionally unable to hear that kind of sentence and do nothing with it. Eleanor had taken one bite and gone completely still. "My mother's was a little less sweet," Eleanor said. "I can adjust it next time." "Don't!" Eleanor set her fork down with the precision of someone handling something fragile. "Don't adjust it." Across the table, Danny was telling a story that required both hands to illustrate. 2 of the cousins were arguing about something sports-related with the comfortable ferocity of people who argued like this regularly and enjoyed it. The uncles were in a separate conversation that involved lowered voices and no eye contact, which Charlotte had learned meant business and required her to find somewhere else to focus her attention. Vincent was at the end of the table. He was watching Eleanor's face. Charlotte saw him do it, saw the exact moment he clocked the stillness in his grandmother's expression, the closed eyes, whatever private geography Eleanor had briefly traveled to with that one bite of tart. She saw something move across Vincent's face that wasn't the locked expression he wore for everything else. Something older. Something that looked like it had been there a long time and didn't come out often. He looked up. His eyes met Charlotte's across the table. She looked away first, not because she was embarrassed, because she'd learned not to invest in moments that didn't repeat. January arrived with the kind of cold that made the mansion feel like a held breath. Charlotte's book manuscript was due to her editor in March, which meant January and February were going to be brutal in the specific way that final drafts were brutal. Not the exciting difficult of early writing, but the grinding difficult of revision, of cutting things you loved because they were wrong, of sitting with your own inadequacy for hours at a stretch until something finally worked. She set up a proper workspace in the library. Eleanor had told her months ago to treat it as her own, and she'd been tentative about it, but December's version of herself had apparently run out of tentative. She arranged her books, her notes, her laptop, and 2 external hard drives, her terrible collection of mugs she kept meaning to consolidate. She put a small lamp on the side table because the overhead light in the library was the kind of bright that flattened everything, and she needed warmth when she worked. The library became her territory. On a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of January, she was 2 hours into a section on post-war American muralism that was not cooperating, her 3rd cup of tea gone cold, her notes covering the desk in the specific chaos that meant she was actually working when the library door opened. Vincent stood in the doorway. He looked at the desk, at the books, at the 2 empty mugs and the 1 half-full one, at the lamp, which cast a circle that didn't reach the doorway where he was standing. "I didn't know you worked in here," he said. "Eleanor said it was fine." "I'm not questioning it." Charlotte looked at him. He was still in his work clothes, shirt untucked on one side, jacket gone, the kind of end-of-day undone that she'd come to recognize as the closest thing to relaxed he presented in her presence, which was not very relaxed. "I need the constable catalog," he said. "Eleanor thought it was in here." "Third shelf from the top on the east wall," Charlotte said. "The section on British Romanticism. It's between the two Turner volumes." He looked at her for a second longer than the information required. "You've cataloged the library." "I noticed it needed it." He crossed the room, found the shelf, found the catalog. He stood there with it in his hands for a moment that lasted slightly longer than necessary, and Charlotte went back to her screen because she'd learned not to watch those moments either. "Thank you," he said. "Sure." He left. She stared at her screen for 90 seconds without reading a word, then deliberately moved her eyes to the paragraph she'd been working on and forced herself back into it. This was the thing about Vincent Callahan. He produced these moments, small, insufficient, maddening moments that almost meant something. A look across a dinner table, a 3-second pause in a doorway, a thank you that was said to the room rather than to her, technically, but was clearly directed at her. He produced these moments and then moved on from them as if they hadn't happened. And the dangerous thing, the thing Charlotte had been fighting for months, was the pull of them. The way some part of her kept treating them as data. As evidence for a case she was still building, she needed to stop building that case. She made a note about muralism. The invitation came through the Columbia Art History Department in mid-February, the Sterling Foundation Gala, annual fundraiser for historical preservation projects across New York State. Tickets at a price that made most academics laugh until they realized the department was sponsoring 2 attendees and Charlotte was one of them. She'd published a paper the previous spring on Federal-era architectural preservation along the Hudson that had been cited in 2 Sterling Foundation grant applications, which apparently counted for something in rooms she didn't ordinarily access. She went. She wore a dark green dress that she'd bought for a conference 3 years ago and hadn't had occasion for since, and she arrived alone, and she knew approximately 4 people in a room of 300, and none of that bothered her in the way it might once have because she'd spent 8 months living in a house full of people while being profoundly alone. And at this point, a party of strangers felt comparatively manageable. She found the bar and got a glass of something dry and white and stood near the windows overlooking the city and thought about the mural section, which was still not right, and then told herself to stop thinking about the mural section. "You're the Hudson River paper." She turned. The man who had spoken was somewhere around her age, maybe a few years older, with the kind of face that looked like it spent a significant amount of time outdoors, and the kind of posture that came from working with his hands. He was holding a drink and looking at her with an expression of straightforward recognition, not the social performance of recognition, but the actual kind. "I'm Charlotte Hayes," she said. "Nathan Brooks." He shifted his drink to his left hand and offered his right. "Preservation architect. I cited your paper twice in a grant application last fall. I've been hoping to run into you." "Did you get the grant?" "We did?" "Then I'm glad my footnotes were useful." He laughed. It was an unguarded laugh, the kind that didn't calculate whether the room was watching, and Charlotte registered it as what it was. A person who laughed when something was actually funny, rather than when it was socially appropriate to signal amusement. She'd spent 8 months in rooms where almost no one did that. They talked for 40 minutes. He asked about her current research with genuine attention, the kind that produced follow-up questions rather than waiting for its own turn to speak. He pushed back on 2 of her assertions with specific, well-sourced objections that made her sharpen her thinking in real time. He knew the Hudson Valley properties she was writing about not as historical abstractions, but as physical structures he'd worked on. He had opinions about the mortar, about the foundation reinforcement, about the choices that had been made poorly and the ones that hadn't. She disagreed with him about one of them, emphatically, and he grinned at her over his glass and said, "Prove it." And she felt, with a jolt she hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with, like herself. She hadn't felt like herself in a very long time. The Sterling Gala appeared in Charlotte's life 3 more times over the next 6 weeks. Once as a paper she sent Nathan because his objection had been more interesting than he'd probably intended. Once as a coffee meeting at a place near his office in Tribeca to argue about the paper in person. And once as a phone call about a preservation project in Poughkeepsie that he thought might benefit from her archival expertise. The friendship was, in the literal sense of the word, innocent. Charlotte knew this. She also knew, more importantly, that Nathan's presence in her life had nothing to do with marriage or the absence of it, that she would have been interested in exactly this professional friendship in any version of her life because Nathan Brooks was sharp and direct and took her seriously, and those qualities were not in oversupply in her world. That was the whole story. The friendship was what it was, but she was laughing more. This was not a small thing. She hadn't fully understood how quiet she'd become until the silence started lifting. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like pressure she'd stopped noticing until it began, incrementally, to ease. She talked more on the phone. She went back to checking on Eleanor more spontaneously, just because she wanted to, rather than because she was looking for human contact anywhere she could find it. She started cooking for pleasure again rather than as an anxious gesture toward a man who wouldn't receive it. She turned the porch light off one night in February. Not angrily. She just stood in the front hallway and looked at the switch and thought, with a clarity that arrived without drama, that she was done with the particular kind of hope the light had represented. She was 30 years old. She had work she loved. She had Eleanor. She had Danny, who sent her watershed papers with the regularity of a person who had adopted her as his informal academic advisor. She had Nathan, who argued with her about mortar and meant it as respect. She didn't need to leave a light on for someone who had never once looked for it. She turned it off and went upstairs to work. Vincent noticed the light was off on a Thursday night in late February when he came home at 11:30 to a house that was completely dark from the outside and felt, in the 2 seconds before he registered, that everything was simply off rather than wrong. A spike of something cold and sharp in his chest that he could not explain and did not examine. He went inside. He went upstairs. He stood outside Charlotte's door for a moment, not for any reason he could articulate, not with any intention, just stood there the way you sometimes stood in front of a closed door in your own house when something in your body knew something your mind hadn't caught up to yet, and then walked past it to his own room. He didn't sleep well. He attributed this to a problem with one of the port operations in New Jersey that had been developing for 2 weeks and required his attention before it became genuinely dangerous. This was true. The New Jersey situation was real, and it was serious, and it occupied his mind appropriately. He did not think about the porch light. He was coming out of a meeting at the Midtown office on a Tuesday in March. Long meeting, poor outcome, the kind that left him with a jaw full of tension and the specific exhaustion of having spent 3 hours managing men who should not require management, when he rounded the corner of 54th Street and stopped. Charlotte was on the sidewalk ahead of him, maybe 30 feet, standing in conversation with a man Vincent didn't recognize. She was in her work clothes, bag over one shoulder, and she was talking with her hands the way she did when something had her full attention, not the contained version of herself that moved through the Callahan mansion carefully, as if she'd learned the hard way to take up less space, but the other version, the version that apparently existed in the world outside that house, open, unguarded, laughing at something the man had said with her head slightly back and no calculation in it whatsoever. Vincent stopped walking. The man was around his own age, tall, the kind of posture that came from physical confidence rather than performance. He was looking at Charlotte with the easy attention of someone who had developed the habit of looking at her, which was a thing Vincent registered in his body before his mind had processed it. Charlotte put her hand briefly on the man's arm, the reflexive gesture of someone making a point, and the man's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile and not quite something else. And Vincent's chest did the thing it had done 2 weeks ago in the dark hallway, that cold, sharp thing, except this time it lasted longer and came with a name attached, though he refused to use the name. He walked past them on the other side of the street. Charlotte didn't see him. He went back to the office and sat at his desk and looked at the wall for 4 minutes before Marcus, his head of operations and the closest thing he had to a person who knew him, knocked and came in and registered the expression on Vincent's face with the wariness of a man who had worked for Vincent Callahan for 7 years. "What happened?" Marcus said. "Nothing." "You look like something happened." "The New Jersey meeting was a waste of 3 hours. Marcus looked at him. He had the particular patience of someone who had learned when to push and when to wait. "I'll follow up on Jersey," Marcus said. "Do that." Marcus left. Vincent sat at his desk and thought about Charlotte's laugh on the sidewalk and the man's expression and the practiced ease of two people who had developed a habit of each other and understood, with a precision that was almost physical, that he had spent 9 months making the woman who shared his last name and his house into a ghost, and that ghosts, when they finally stopped haunting you, went somewhere else. He went home that evening at 7 o'clock, which was early by his standard. The kitchen was empty. The table had nothing on it. He stood there for a moment, then made himself coffee, and went to his office and worked until midnight, and the house was perfectly quiet around him, and the porch light was off, and that was what he'd chosen, and it was fine. It was fine. He started paying attention. He didn't decide to. That would have required him to admit something about why. He simply began to notice things he hadn't noticed before, with the helpless compulsion of someone who had been looking at a painting for a year and had suddenly seen the thing the painter actually meant. She was always reading 2 books at once. One was always work-related, the other was always something completely different, a novel, a history of something obscure. Once a manual on Japanese joinery that she'd left on the kitchen counter with 3 pages flagged and that she'd been visibly annoyed to find he'd moved when she couldn't locate it. She had 3 different laughs. The polite one she used with people she didn't know well, which was pleasant and gave nothing away. The real one, which he'd seen with Eleanor and with Danny, and that Tuesday with the man on the street, which was quick and complete and didn't wait for the room's permission. And a third one, quieter, that she sometimes produced alone when she was working and encountered something in her research that apparently surprised or delighted her. He'd heard it twice from outside the library, and it was the most undefended sound he'd ever heard another person make. She argued with Eleanor. This had taken him longer to register because it looked superficially like conversation, but he'd spent enough time now actually listening to understand that what happened between Charlotte and his grandmother was genuine intellectual combat conducted with mutual affection and no mercy on either side. Eleanor told Charlotte she was wrong about a painter. Charlotte told Eleanor the evidence didn't support that position. Eleanor cited a source. Charlotte pointed out the source's institutional bias. Eleanor said she'd met the man and Charlotte hadn't. Charlotte said meeting someone wasn't the same as being right about them. Eleanor laughed so hard she spilled her tea. Vincent stood in the hallway outside the sitting room and listened to this exchange and felt something crack in him at a depth he hadn't expected. He found them in Eleanor's desk on a Sunday afternoon in March. He'd been looking for a property deed, old Hudson Valley land record that Eleanor had mentioned keeping somewhere in the house. And he'd been through 3 places she might have put it before he tried the writing desk in her sitting room, which she kept organized with a specificity that usually made things findable. He found the deed in the second drawer. He also found, in the back of the same drawer beneath a leather portfolio, 3 envelopes. His name wasn't on them. Eleanor's was. He shouldn't have read them. He knew that. He read them. The first one was dated 18 months ago. Charlotte's handwriting, which he recognized from 9 months of notes he'd never answered. Careful, slightly right-leaning, the handwriting of someone who'd been taught to write properly and had maintained it. The letter was polite and clear and explained with the measured language of someone who had thought carefully about how to say a difficult thing kindly that she was grateful for Eleanor's trust and was deeply fond of her, but that she did not think she could accept the marriage arrangement. She had explained her reasons. They were good reasons. She had thanked Eleanor for everything. The second letter was 6 weeks later, different in tone, more urgent underneath the same careful surface. She had thought about it more. She still didn't think it was right. She didn't want to disappoint Eleanor, but she was asking Eleanor, please, not to push this further. She was asking to be considered. She was asking for her own life to be worth more than what it meant to someone else's peace of mind. The third letter was 10 days before the wedding. It was shorter. She had said yes, she had agreed, but she needed Eleanor to understand she was doing this for Eleanor alone, and not because she believed it was the right decision for herself. She had said she hoped Eleanor understood what she was asking of her. Vincent sat in Eleanor's sitting room chair with 3 letters in his hand and felt the floor go somewhere he couldn't follow. He sat there for a long time. He thought about the dinner where she'd paid her own bill. He thought about the ironing board in the guest room. He thought about the breakfast table, 9 months of breakfast he'd walked past with his phone in his hand, and the notes he'd never answered, and the porch light that had finally gone out in February. He thought about the laugh on the sidewalk that had made his chest go cold, That laugh that didn't wait for permission. That laugh that was going somewhere that wasn't his house. He thought about what he had decided in the first 3 seconds of watching her walk down the aisle toward him. What he had locked into place with the completeness of a man who had never once considered he might be wrong. He set the letters back exactly where he'd found them, in the order he'd found them. And he sat there in his grandmother's sitting room in the particular silence of a man who has just discovered that the story he's been living was never the actual story. He sat there until Eleanor came in and found him. She looked at the desk drawer. She looked at his face. She said nothing. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Because you would have used it as another reason to stay behind your wall," Eleanor said. She sat down across from him with the careful movement of a woman whose body required more negotiation than it once had. "You needed to learn it yourself. I just didn't know if you'd learn it in time." "In time for what?" Eleanor looked at him with the expression she reserved for questions she considered beneath his intelligence. He already knew the answer. He went upstairs. He stood in the hallway outside Charlotte's door and looked at the closed door with the 3 letters still burning somewhere behind his sternum, and he raised his hand to knock, and he stopped. He lowered his hand. He went to his own room. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the carpet and understood, with a precision that felt like something breaking cleanly along a fault line that had been building for years, that guilt was not the same as the right to be forgiven, and that the next move was not his to take without cost. The following morning, he came downstairs to find Charlotte's coat already gone from the hook by the door, and on the kitchen table, placed with the deliberate quietness of someone who had thought very carefully about where to put it, was a white envelope with his name on it in that careful, slightly right-leaning handwriting. He stood in the kitchen and looked at it. He did not need to open it to know what it contained. Vincent opened the envelope standing up. He hadn't sat down, hadn't made coffee, hadn't done any of the things his body usually did on autopilot in the morning because his body had recognized before his mind did that this was not an autopilot morning. He stood in the kitchen in yesterday's clothes. He hadn't slept, not really, 2 hours somewhere after 3 that didn't count. And he opened the envelope with the deliberate steadiness of a man who had trained himself to open things calmly, regardless of what he expected to find inside. The letter was short. Charlotte wrote the way she did everything he'd observed about her, without waste. She said she was not leaving in anger. She said she wanted him to understand that because she thought it mattered. She said she had entered the marriage with clear eyes, and she had tried in the ways she knew how to build something inside it, and she understood now that you could not build something alone and call it a shared life. She said she had found a lawyer and the paperwork was in process and she would make it as simple as possible. She said she hoped he would tell Eleanor gently. The last line said, "I don't think you're a bad person, Vincent. I think you never decided to be a person at all inside this marriage. That's not the same thing, but it has the same result." He read it twice. He folded it along its original creases and set it on the table. He stood there for another minute looking at it, and then he picked up his keys and walked out. He drove for an hour without destination, which was not something Vincent Callahan did. He was a man of destinations, of scheduled movement between known points, of cars and drivers and routes planned in advance so that transit time could be used for calls. He drove alone through the gray March morning on roads that took him north along the river, the Hudson flat and colorless on his left, bare trees on ridgelines to the right, and he drove with both hands on the wheel and no music and no calls and nothing except the sound of the road and the thing in his chest that had no name he was willing to give it yet. He thought about his father. This was not something he did often or willingly. His father had been dead for 26 years, which was long enough that the man had calcified in Vincent's memory into a set of impressions rather than a person. The weight of a hand on his shoulder, the smell of a particular brand of cigarette, a voice that had projected authority the way other voices projected warmth. His mother was less even than that. 3.5 years old was too young to retain much. He had photographs of her. In the photographs, she had dark eyes and a laughing expression and looked like someone who laughed easily and often. Eleanor had raised him. Eleanor had raised him with ferocious love and had also, in the way of people who loved through catastrophic loss, taught him without meaning to that the cost of attachment was devastation, that the people closest to you were the most capable of disappearing. Eleanor hadn't taught him this with words. She'd taught him by crying behind closed doors when she thought he was asleep, by the way she held him slightly too tight in the years after his parents died, by the particular quality of her vigilance, always watching, always counting, always conducting the silent inventory of a person who knew from experience that the people you loved could simply stop being there. He had learned the lesson. He had learned it so well it had become structural. He'd built everything on top of it, the discipline, the control, the organization of his attention around work and duty and the management of threat. He'd built a life that functioned, that was by any external measure successful, and he'd done it by becoming exactly the kind of person who could walk away from his own wedding without looking back. He pulled over on a gravel turnout above the river. He sat with the engine running and looked at the water and thought about Charlotte's letter and the 3 letters before it, and the 9 months he'd spent in the same house as a woman who had entered his life already carrying sacrifice, and he had looked at her and decided, in 3 seconds, without evidence, that she was a threat. He had been, in the precise and unambiguous meaning of the word, wrong. The question now was whether wrong was something you could do anything about after the damage was complete. He didn't know the answer. He drove back. Inti. Eleanor was waiting for him. This did not surprise him. Eleanor had been conducting tactical patients since before he was born, and she was not about to stop now. She was in the sitting room in her chair by the window, the room's best light at this hour falling across the side of her face, and she looked up when he came in with the expression of a woman who had been deciding exactly how much to say. "She's gone," he said. "She went to work. She'll be back this evening." "She's filing for divorce." "I know." "You knew she was going to." "I thought she might." Eleanor's hands were in her lap, folded. "I hoped I was wrong." Vincent sat down across from her. He sat forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at his grandmother and felt, for the first time in a conversation with her in more years than he could track, completely without defense. "The letters," he said. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "She asked you not to do this," he said. 3 times. "Yes." "You did it anyway." "I did." The room held that for a moment. "Tell me why," he said. Not an accusation. A genuine question, which was rarer from him than it should have been. Eleanor was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer, and then she said, "Because I watched you build a tomb and call it a life for 15 years, and I didn't know how else to put a door in it." He said nothing. "I was wrong to do it the way I did it," Eleanor said. "I was not wrong about what I was trying to do." She paused. "Charlotte was never meant to be a solution to your problem, Vincent. She was meant to be an opportunity. What you did with the opportunity was your own business. I just thought if I could get you in the same house—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened briefly. "I miscalculated how thoroughly you could ignore someone living directly in front of you." "I didn't ignore her." Eleanor looked at him. He stopped. He tried again. "I made a decision about who she was, early, and I didn't revisit it." "No," Eleanor said. "You didn't." The sitting room was very quiet. Outside the window, the March light had shifted to the flat gray of incoming cloud. Somewhere in the house, Maria was moving around doing something in the kitchen that produced small domestic sounds. A cabinet, running water, something set down on the counter. "She's not a person who does things for money," he said. He wasn't saying it to Eleanor exactly. He was saying it out loud because he needed to hear it said. "No," Eleanor said. "She's not. I treated her like she was." "You treated her like she was a variable in your risk assessment," Eleanor said, with the precision of someone who had been formulating the sentence for some time. "That was worse than treating her like she was after the money. At least that would have acknowledged she existed." Vincent looked at his hands. He had large hands. He'd always been aware of them. They were not hands that suggested gentleness, and he'd spent most of his adult life living up to that implication. He looked at them now and thought about Charlotte's handwriting, that careful right-leaning script, and the 9 months of notes in that handwriting that he'd read and set aside without response. "What do I do?" he said. This was not something Vincent Callahan said. In the 34 years of his life, he could count on minimal fingers the number of times he'd asked another person what to do. He ran things. He decided things. Other people brought him problems, and he told them the path forward. This was not personal modesty. It was simply an accurate account of how his life had been organized. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment with something in her expression that was not quite hope and not quite grief, and was probably the specific combination of both that you arrived at when you loved someone through decades of watching them miss the point. "You already know what to do," she said. "You just want me to make it easier to start." He sat with that. "She's not going to forgive you for words," Eleanor said. "She's heard enough words that led to nothing. And she's not a woman who needs rescue. I want you to understand that clearly. She was whole before she came into this house, and she'll be whole after she leaves it. The only question is whether you can become someone worth choosing." There's a difference. There's an enormous difference. Eleanor reached across and put her hand over his briefly, the way she'd done when he was 7 years old, and something had frightened him. Being needed is easy. A man like you will always be needed. Being wanted is another thing entirely. That you're going to have to earn. She took her hand back. "Start with being present," she said. "That's all. Start there." He was present at dinner. This sounds like nothing, and in any ordinary marriage it would be nothing, but in the specific architecture of the Callahan household over the preceding 9 months, Vincent Callahan sitting at the dinner table at 7 o'clock and being present, not working at the table, not halfway through a call, not appearing briefly before disappearing, was so unusual that Maria visibly startled when she came in to set the table and found him already there. Charlotte came in at 7:15. She stopped when she saw him. The expression on her face was not what he expected. He'd anticipated something cold or something careful, the expression of someone who had deployed the controlled distance she'd been developing for months. Instead, what he saw, for just a second before she controlled it, was exhaustion. Pure, undefended exhaustion. The expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had not yet found a place to set it down. She sat down. "I read your letter," he said. "I didn't write it to open a conversation." "I know." She looked at him steadily. Her eyes were very clear. He'd noticed that about her before, that her eyes didn't deflect, didn't soften things unnecessarily, looked at what was actually in front of them. "The lawyer is expecting my call tomorrow," she said. "I'm not asking you to stop that." A pause. "Then what are you doing?" "I'm having dinner," he said. "If that's all right?" Charlotte looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone examining something for structural integrity. Then she picked up her fork. They ate dinner. They did not have a conversation. They were two people in the same room eating food that Maria had prepared, and the silence between them was not comfortable, but it was not the same silence it had been for 9 months. It had texture now, had weight, was the silence of two people who were at least both present in it rather than one person sitting alone. When he cleared his own plate, Charlotte looked up. He said goodnight. He went upstairs. He lay in bed and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours and thought about what Eleanor had said about being present and what presence actually cost a man who had organized his entire life around the management of distance. The answer was everything he'd taught himself to protect. He wasn't sure yet if he could pay that. He was there in the morning, and the morning after. He didn't try to fill the silence with explanation or apology, because he'd read Charlotte's letter carefully enough to understand that explanation and apology were not the currency she needed from him. She needed the thing itself, not the announcement of the thing, and the thing was simply consistency. The most difficult performance for a man who had never had to maintain it for another person. Charlotte watched him the way you watched a structural change that might or might not hold, with the particular skepticism of someone who had learned from experience to wait for the collapse before she believed in the stability. She was not unkind. She was not warm. She was exactly what she'd been the morning she placed the divorce papers on the table. A woman who had stopped needing him to choose her, which meant if he was going to choose her anyway, he was going to have to do it in full view of that indifference and without the reward of any early encouragement. He was there on a Thursday evening when she came back from a meeting in the city later than she had expected, and he had eaten already but had left the kitchen light on, and she'd stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the light, and then looked at him in the sitting room adjacent and said nothing. But the expression on her face had shifted 1 degree towards something he didn't have a name for yet. He said nothing either. He went back to reading. The meeting with Nathan happened on a Friday in the third week of March. Charlotte had agreed to it weeks ago, a site visit to a property in Poughkeepsie that Nathan's firm was assessing for a preservation grant, a property that touched directly on her archival research and that he'd specifically wanted her perspective on. She went. The work was the work, and she had not organized her professional life around the state of her marriage and didn't intend to start now. Nathan met her at the property at 10. He was already walking the perimeter when she arrived, his architect's eye doing what it did, reading the structure the way she read documents, looking for what the surface concealed about the history underneath. He raised a hand when he saw her, and she walked over and they stood together looking at the facade, and he said, "The cornice is a later addition, mid-1890s, doesn't belong to the original structure at all." And she said, "I know, there's a letter in the state archive from the original owner complaining about the restoration." And they were off. They worked the property for 3 hours. It was good work, the kind that made the morning disappear, that required enough focus to crowd out everything else. And Charlotte was aware during it of the specific relief of being inside a task she was competent at, with a person who expected competence from her and offered it in return. She was aware of it the way you became aware of things you'd been missing only when they were temporarily restored. At noon, they found a diner nearby and sat across a booth from each other with bad coffee, and Nathan pulled out his notes and they went through the structural assessment, and Charlotte pulled out her archive photographs and they compared and disagreed and refined. Somewhere in the third hour of the morning, Nathan had started looking at her slightly differently. Not inappropriately, nothing that crossed a line or required a response, just the particular shift in attention that happens sometimes, that quiet reorganization of how a person was looking at you. Charlotte had noticed it and filed it in the category of things she understood and was not going to act on and did not need to make complicated. In the diner, over the bad coffee, Nathan said, "You seem different than the last time I saw you." "Different how?" I don't know. Less like you're deciding whether it's safe to be in the room." Charlotte looked at her coffee. "Things at home have been complicated," she said. Nathan nodded. He had a quality she appreciated. He did not push at personal things. He received what was offered and didn't mind for more. "The property's worth the application," she said. "I'll write a supporting letter." "That would be significant, thank you." She drove back to Westchester in the early afternoon, thinking about structure, about what made things hold and what made them fail, about the difference between original construction and later additions that didn't belong, about the things you could restore and the things that were simply gone. Vincent was home when she arrived, at 3 in the afternoon on a Friday, which was not his pattern. He was in the library. She registered this as she passed the doorway. And he looked up when she passed and said her name, not as a greeting exactly, more as an acknowledgement, the way you acknowledged a person whose presence in a room you'd registered. She stopped in the doorway. "You're home early," she said. "I moved a meeting." He said it without explanation, without the qualifications she would have expected if he'd been trying to make a point of it. Just stated it. She looked at him. He was at the reading table, papers spread out, her lamp on. She noted this, that he'd used her lamp rather than the overhead, which meant he'd been here long enough to have a preference about the light. There was a coffee mug she recognized as Eleanor's second-best pottery piece, the one that lived on the second kitchen shelf. "There's more coffee if you want it," he said. "I made enough." Charlotte stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen and poured herself a cup and came back and sat in the reading chair on the other side of the table. Not at the table itself, the chair she'd put there in January because she sometimes needed to think sideways, not forward, and a chair at an angle to the main table suited that. And she opened her bag and took out her notes from the Poughkeepsie property. They worked in the same room for 2 hours. They did not speak much. The library had its own sound. The quality of two people breathing and thinking and occasionally shifting, the sound of pages and pens, the specific silence of shared concentration. Charlotte was aware of it. She was aware of him. She was aware that she was aware, and that being aware was different from being willing, and that the distance between those two things was still very large. At 5 o'clock, she set her notes down and said to no one in particular, Nathan thinks the Poughkeepsie property is restorable. I agree with him. I'm writing a supporting letter for the grant. Vincent said, Brooks, the preservation architect. She looked at him. You know who he is? I've done some reading. Charlotte set her pen down. What kind of reading? The question had an edge in it, not concealed. She wanted him to hear it. Vincent met her eyes and didn't look away from the edge. I saw you talking to him on 54th Street in March. I didn't know who he was. I found out. By having someone check on me. By looking him up myself. There's a difference. There is, he said. I know what kind of difference it is. She looked at him for a long moment. The library was very quiet. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was doing what it did in March, going gold before it went gray, the brief window of warmth before the cold reasserted itself. He's a colleague, she said. He's become a friend. There's nothing else to tell you. I know? You know because you looked him up, or you know because you believe me. I know because I looked him up, Vincent said, and what I found confirmed what I should have assumed before I looked him up, which tells you more about my default assumptions than it tells you anything about Nathan Brooks. Charlotte absorbed this. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her in 10 months of living in the same house, and it arrived without preamble or performance, and she didn't know what to do with it except file it in the growing category of things she was noting but not yet willing to trust. The divorce process is moving forward, she said. I know. I need you to understand that I'm not holding it over you. It's not a negotiation tool, it's just where I am. I understand. She stood and picked up her notes. Thank you for the coffee. She left the library. Vincent sat alone in the room she'd built out of nothing in January, with her lamp still on and her specific chaos of books arranged in the way she'd arranged them. And he sat there in the particular quality of her absence and understood something that he could not have understood 9 months ago, or 3 months ago, or possibly even 3 weeks ago. He had spent his entire adult life managing threats, identifying them, neutralizing them, controlling the variables around them. He had looked at Charlotte on their wedding day and filed her under threat without evidence, and he had organized his behavior accordingly, and the management had been so complete and so efficient that he had successfully neutralized not a threat, but a person. And now that person had correctly evaluated the situation and was extracting herself from it, and the thing he was feeling was not the focused alertness of a man managing a threat. It was the open, unmanageable, exposed terror of a man who had destroyed something real. That was different. He didn't know what to do with different. He went to Eleanor's sitting room that evening and sat across from her, and they didn't talk for a while, the way they sometimes didn't talk, the way they'd learned to be in a room together through 26 years of shared history. Eventually, Eleanor said, "She's not softening." "No. She's watching. That's not the same as softening." "I know the difference." Eleanor looked at him. "Do you?" He thought about it seriously, the way he should have thought about more things seriously a year ago. "She's watching to see if it holds," he said. "She doesn't trust that it's real yet. She's waiting for the version of me she knew for 9 months to reassert itself." "And will it?" "No." "How do you know?" He looked at his grandmother. He looked at her with the fullness of attention he'd been learning to offer in the past 2 weeks. The real kind. The kind that didn't calculate or manage. "Because I know what it cost," he said. "What the other version cost. I'm not going back to that." Eleanor held his gaze. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "Nathan Brooks came to see me today," she said. The room shifted. "He came here. He called first. I told him he could come." Eleanor's voice was even, and her hands were still in her lap, and she was watching him with the careful attention of someone who needed to see his first reaction before she said the next thing. "He wanted to talk to me about Charlotte." Vincent did not move. "He's in love with her," Eleanor said. "He didn't say it in those words. He didn't need to. He came to ask me, as the person in this family who knows Charlotte best, whether he should tell her." She paused. "He's a decent man. He wanted to do it right. He didn't want to step into something if there was something real here." The quality of the silence in the room changed completely. "What did you tell him?" Vincent said. His voice was level. The voice he used in rooms where losing your composure had consequences. But underneath it, something was happening that had nothing to do with composure. A cold, acute, full-body understanding of what it meant to have spent 9 months ignoring something and then turned around to find the window closing. "I told him the truth," Eleanor said. "I told him that my grandson had made serious mistakes and was trying to correct them, and that Charlotte was a woman who made her own decisions, and that he would need to ask her himself." "You sent him to Charlotte." "I told him the truth." Vincent stood. "When?" "He's meeting her tomorrow morning. He called her before he came to see me." Vincent stood in his grandmother's sitting room with the floor somewhere below him and the walls a little closer than usual, and understood, with a completeness that left no room for argument, that the mistake he'd made in 3 seconds on a wedding day was about to become permanent. That the woman he had spent 9 months learning to see was about to be asked a question by a man who had seen her from the beginning, and that he had no right, not a thread of actual right, to stand between her and that question. He walked out. He stood in the hallway outside Charlotte's closed door and put his hand flat against the wood and stayed there, not knocking, not moving, just holding the reality of the closed door the way you held something that was already becoming the past, even while you were still standing in the present. He had one morning. Between now and Nathan Brooks asking Charlotte Hayes if she would choose him, Vincent Callahan had one morning to become someone she had a reason to. He didn't sleep. He didn't try to. He sat in the chair by his bedroom window and watched the dark over the river and let himself feel the full weight of what was coming without the management, without the organizing of it into something controllable. Because the one thing he understood about tomorrow was that it was not a problem that could be managed. You could not manage your way into being someone worth choosing. You could not organize your way back from 9 months of organized absence. There was no tactical solution to the fact that he had been, in every way that counted, not there, and that another man had been there from the beginning, in the specific way that mattered, which was the way of genuine attention. He sat with that until 4 in the morning, when the sky began differentiating itself from black into something a shade less absolute, and then he stood and went downstairs. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window with the mug in both hands and watched the grounds go from dark to gray to the particular pale of early March dawn, and he thought about Eleanor's face when she'd told him about Nathan Brooks. The careful quality of her watching. She'd needed to see his first reaction, and what she'd seen in his first reaction had told her something, and she had not told him what it had told her because she was Eleanor Callahan, and she had been making him work for things his entire life because she believed, correctly, that the work was the point. He set the mug down. He went upstairs and knocked on Charlotte's door. She answered in a robe, her hair not yet dealt with, and the expression on her face when she saw him was not irritation or suspicion, but the specific alertness of someone who had been awake and was not surprised to be interrupted. She'd been awake. He registered that, filed it away. "It's 5:30, she said. "I know. I'm sorry." She looked at him. The hallway was dim. The sun wasn't fully up, the overhead light harsh, so she hadn't turned it on. They stood in the half-dark, and she looked at him with those clear, direct eyes and waited. "Nathan Brooks came to see Eleanor yesterday," he said. Something shifted in her face. Not surprise, exactly. More like the confirmation of something she'd been quietly computing. "Eleanor told you," Charlotte said. "Last night." She was quiet for a moment. Her hand was on the doorframe. He watched her absorb the information and decide what to do with it, could see the decision-making in the slight tightening around her eyes. "That's between Nathan and me," she said. "I know. So why are you at my door at 5:30? "Because I'm not going to let the morning happen without telling you something first. And I need to tell you now, before it means anything about what he's going to ask you. I need to tell you while there's still no advantage in it for me." She looked at him for a long moment. The house was completely still around them. The staff not yet arrived, Eleanor asleep, the whole building holding its breath in the way buildings did in that specific hour. "Say it then," she said. "I was wrong about you," he said. "From the beginning. I made a decision before I had information, and I used it to justify 9 months of absence, and I hurt you. Not carelessly, carefully. I was precise about it, which is worse." He stopped. His voice was doing the thing it did when he was operating on no sleep and something mattered, going slightly rough at the edges. "I read Eleanor's letters, the ones you sent her, and I understood something that I should have understood from the first morning I walked past a breakfast table you'd set for both of us without stopping." Charlotte's hand tightened on the doorframe. "You didn't marry me for anything I had," he said. "You married me because you loved someone enough to sacrifice your own life for her peace of mind. And I looked at that sacrifice and decided it was calculation." He held her gaze. "I don't have a way to make that right. I'm not asking you to believe I can. I'm just telling you that I know what you did and what I did and what it cost you. That's all." She was very still. "Is that everything?" she said. "No." He felt the next part in his chest before it reached his voice. "The other thing is that I notice you now, all of it. The 3 different laughs and the 2 books at once, and the way you argue with Eleanor like it's a professional obligation. The paper on Hudson River architecture that 2 preservation architects have cited. The way Danny talks to you like you're the first adult who ever took him seriously. I notice all of it, and I know it's 9 months too late. And I know that being noticed is not the same as being treated like a person who deserved it from the start." He stopped. The hallway was so quiet he could hear his own pulse. "But I wanted you to have it," he said. "Before today. I wanted you to know that you were seen, even if you leave." Charlotte looked at him. She looked at him with those clear eyes for so long and so steadily that he felt it the way you felt, being examined by someone who had developed a precise tool for cutting through surface. Not comfortable, not unpleasant, just accurate. She was reading him the way she read documents, looking for what the surface concealed. "I have to get ready," she said. "I know." She stepped back and closed the door. He stood in the hallway. He stood there for 30 seconds, maybe 40, and then he walked to the stairs and sat down on the top step and put his head in his hands and stayed there. Not in performance of anything, just in the specific physical weight of having said the true thing to the right person at the wrong time and having nothing to do about the timing. He was in the kitchen when she came downstairs. She was dressed for work, the dark jacket she wore when she had something important on her schedule. He'd learned to read the wardrobe in the same way he'd learned to read everything else about her recently, too late and too completely. She came into the kitchen and he was at the stove and there was a pot of oatmeal and cut fruit and coffee already made. She stopped. She looked at the stove and then at him. "You don't have to eat it," he said. He stopped. He didn't have a good completion for that sentence, so he left it there. Charlotte set her bag down on the chair by the door. She poured coffee. She sat at the table. He put a bowl in front of her and she ate without saying anything, and he sat across from her and drank his coffee. And outside the March morning was doing something almost gentle with the light, the sun up enough now to come through the east-facing windows at the long angle that turned the kitchen warm for about 20 minutes before it moved. "What time does Eleanor wake up?" Charlotte said. 7 usually. "She'll want to know how this goes." "Probably." Charlotte looked at him over the rim of her mug. "Are you going to the office today?" "Yes." "Before or after you pace around this house for 2 hours?" He looked at her. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something smaller and more complicated. The specific expression of a person who is acknowledging something real without committing to anything about what it meant. "After," he said. She nodded. She drank her coffee. She picked up her bag. At the door, she stopped and turned back and looked at him across the kitchen. The length of the room between them, the morning light making the space between them specific and visible. "What you said in the hallway," she said. "I'm not telling you it's enough. I'm not telling you it changes the process." She held his gaze. "But it was true. I could tell it was true. And I haven't had a lot of true from this marriage, so She stopped. She looked away briefly, then back. "I'm noting it." She left. He stood in the kitchen and listened to the front door close and the sound of her car in the drive, and then silence. And his whole chest was doing something he didn't have precise language for, something that sat between the specific pain of someone who had woken up in time and the specific terror of someone who might have woken up one morning too late. He was at the office by 9. He sat through 2 meetings and was present for them in the physical sense and in no other sense. Marcus, running the second meeting, gave him the look he reserved for when the boss's body was in the room and his mind was somewhere else. And Vincent said, "Go ahead," to something Marcus was waiting on authorization for, and Marcus went ahead and the meeting ended, and he sat in his office and looked at his phone. Nathan Brooks had a reputation that was easy to find if you looked, which Vincent had. Good architect, well-regarded firm. Projects with genuine impact, not the prestige theater kind of preservation work, but the actual difficult kind where you had to fight municipalities for funding and argue with contractors about materials and spend 2 years on a building that 300 people would walk past daily without knowing the difference. The kind of work Charlotte respected. He had known that about her before he knew anything else. His phone was on the desk. He picked it up, set it down, picked it up again. He called Marcus in. "I need to leave at noon," he said. Marcus looked at him. "The 2 o'clock with the Newark contact. Reschedule it." Vincent. "Reschedule it, Marcus." Marcus looked at him with the 7 years of reading him in his face and then said, "All right," and left. Vincent sat in his office until noon, and then he got in his car and he drove to Columbia University. He'd found the lecture schedule 3 days ago. He hadn't told himself what he was going to do with it. He had the information the way he had a lot of information. Filed, available, not yet assigned a purpose. He knew now what the purpose was. The lecture was in a building on the south end of campus, a seminar room on the 3rd floor that held maybe 60 people. He found it 12 minutes before the hour, the door open, students filtering in with the particular unhurried energy of people who had nowhere else to be but hadn't fully decided to be here yet. He stood in the hallway and looked through the door and saw the room. Good light from tall windows, chalkboard still bearing diagrams from a previous class, wooden chairs with the patina of decades of academic friction. He went in and sat at the back. He was the only person in the room over 35 who wasn't a professor. 2 students near the front glanced back at him with the mild curiosity of people noting an anomaly and then returning to their phones. He sat with his jacket on and his hands on the desk and waited. Charlotte came in at 3 minutes to the hour. She was talking over her shoulder to a student who'd followed her in with a question, her bag over one shoulder, a stack of folders under her arm, moving with the specific, purposeful ease of someone fully in their environment. She set the folders on the lectern, answered the student's question with 3 sentences and a reference to a page number, and the student went to their seat satisfied, and Charlotte looked at her notes for about 15 seconds and then looked up at the room. She saw him. The 15 seconds that followed were something he would carry for a long time. She looked at him, directly, without pretending she hadn't registered him, without the social management of looking away and reorienting, and something happened in her face that moved too fast and too complex for him to fully catalog. Surprise was in there. Something sharper. Something that might have been the involuntary softening of someone who was working very hard to stay in control of their own narrative and had just encountered a variable they hadn't accounted for. She looked at her notes. She began. He had heard her talk before. The dinner with Eleanor in the library, the quick back and forth of practical conversation. He had not heard her teach. It was different in the way that mattered. She was precise without being flattened, demanding without performing authority, able to hold the thread of a complex argument through tangent and interruption and the particular entropy of a room full of people who hadn't yet decided whether the subject was worth their full attention. She made them decide, not with volume or theater, but with the specific gravity of someone who was genuinely interested in what they were saying, who had thought about it more than was strictly required, and wanted the thinking out loud with someone. Students who had been on their phones were not on their phones. 20 minutes in, a student challenged her on a sourcing decision in her research, and she stopped, considered the challenge with visible honesty, and said, "That's a fair point, and the answer is that the source has a documented institutional bias that I footnoted, but you're right that I should have foregrounded it more in the text." Just like that. No defensive maneuvering, no pulling rank. He sat in the back of the room and felt something in his chest that was not the cold, sharp thing, not the terror of the night before, not any of the difficult things. It was something simpler, something that didn't have the quality of anxiety in it. Pride. Uncomplicated, unexpected pride. He had nothing to do with what she was doing up there. He hadn't built any part of it. He'd spent 9 months in the same house as this and had missed it entirely. But she was extraordinary, and he was sitting in the back of her classroom understanding that for the first time without any qualification, and it was both the best thing he'd felt in recent memory and the thing that hurt the most. The lecture ended. Students gathered their things with the specific post-class energy of people released from a productive tension. A few approached Charlotte at the lectern with follow-up questions. She answered each one. The room slowly emptied. He stayed. When the last student left, Charlotte looked across the empty room at him. She didn't say anything. He stood and came down the rows toward the front and stopped with about 8 feet between them and the room very quiet around them, and the afternoon light coming through the tall windows at the angle it had reached by 4 o'clock. "Why?" she said. "Because I wanted to see it." "You could have told me that." "You would have said no." She looked at him. "Yes, I would have." A pause. "Was it—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly. "Did you—" "You're extraordinary," he said. "I'm not saying it to get something from you. I'm saying it because I've been in a lot of rooms with a lot of people who were very good at what they did, and what you just did up there was different." The students who came in not sure they wanted to be here left sure. "That's rare. That's a real thing." Her jaw moved slightly. She looked at the window. "Nathan's meeting me at 6, she said, "at a coffee place near his office." "I know. I'm not telling you as an update. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that I'm going to that meeting and I'm going to hear what he has to say and I'm going to make my own decision, and whatever that decision is, it's mine." "I know. And you being here doesn't—" She stopped. Her voice had done something she clearly hadn't intended it to do, and she stopped to get it back. "This doesn't erase the process." "I'm not asking you to erase the process." "Then what are you asking?" He looked at her. "Time," he said. "I know I don't have a right to it. I know I burned through 9 months of it without understanding what it was. I'm asking anyway because the alternative is watching you walk out of this room and having said everything I had and nothing that was enough." Charlotte looked at him for a long time. The room held all of it. The long months of absence and the recent weeks of showing up, the breakfast table and the library lamp, the porch light she'd turned off, and the hallway door he'd stood outside with his hand flat against the wood. All of it was in the room with them, accumulated, specific, real. "I have to go," she said. She picked up her folders and her bag. At the door she turned. "The oatmeal was good," she said. "This morning." She left. He stood in the empty classroom for a moment and then sat down in the nearest chair, the kind of wooden seminar chair that was not built for comfort, and put his hands on the desk and breathed. The call came at 5:47. He was in his car in the Columbia parking structure, and his phone lit up with Marcus's name, which meant it wasn't personal and it wasn't going away. He answered. "The Newark situation," Marcus said. "It's moved." "How far?" "DeLuca's people made contact with the Riverside crew. Direct contact. They're not waiting." Vincent's body went into the mode that his body went into for work. The particular settling of attention that happened when a threat was real and present and required the version of him that had built the Callahan operation from a fractured inheritance into what it currently was. He could feel it happening, the shift, the narrowing. "Who's on site?" "Caruso and 2 men. It's not enough." "Get Morrison. Get Reyes. Send them now." He was already starting the car. "I need the Newark warehouse address, and I need the contact that moved, and I need to know if DeLuca is there personally or sending representatives." "DeLuca's not there. His son." "His son." Vincent pulled out of the parking space. "How old?" 23. "Does he know what he's doing?" "He thinks he does." That was the most dangerous kind. Vincent hit the ramp and the structure opened onto the street and he went left toward the highway, and his phone was in his hand and his mind was in the operational mode, and somewhere in the part of him that didn't shut off for work. Charlotte was walking into a coffee place near Nathan Brooks's office, and he was going in the opposite direction at 60 miles an hour. He called Marcus back on speaker. "I need 2 hours to handle this." 2 hours might not be enough. "It's going to have to be. The highway opened up, and he pushed the car to the speed it could hold, and the March evening came down around him gray and fast, and the Newark skyline appeared ahead against the darkening sky, and he thought about 23-year-old Dominic DeLuca, who thought he knew what he was doing, and he thought about Charlotte in a coffee shop with a man who had known from the beginning what she was worth, and he drove. The Newark warehouse had the particular atmosphere of a place where a confrontation had been building for long enough that everyone present was running on adrenaline and bad decisions. Caruso met him at the door with the controlled tension of a man who'd been holding a situation together with insufficient personnel. DeLuca's kid has 4 men, Caruso said. They moved the product 2 hours ago. They're claiming the arrangement was verbal, and there's nothing on paper, and they're daring us to escalate. Where? Back office. Vincent walked through the warehouse without hurrying. Hurrying in a room like this communicated the wrong thing. It told the room that you believed the threat was larger than you were, and in these rooms that belief became self-fulfilling. Dominic DeLuca was 23 and had his father's jaw and none of his father's patience, which was saying something because his father's patience was already in short supply. He was standing in the back office with 2 men behind him and the specific posture of someone who had rehearsed this moment and was committed to the version they'd rehearsed. He looked at Vincent. He'd clearly expected someone to send a representative. Mr. Callahan, Dominic said. The product, Vincent said. Where did it go? There was a misunderstanding about the arrangement. That's not what I asked. My father felt. Your father sent you, Vincent said. Which means your father wants to know if I'll negotiate with someone who doesn't have authorization to finalize anything, which is his way of finding out how serious the situation is without risking someone who matters. He looked at the kid steadily. Tell me where the product went, and we can talk about the misunderstanding. Don't tell me, and this becomes a different conversation, and you're not equipped for the different conversation. Dominic's jaw moved. One of the men behind him shifted his weight. Vincent tracked the shift without looking directly at it. His body had run the calculation before his mind had. 2 behind Dominic, 2 more somewhere in the building, Caruso at the door with Morrison now, and Reyes covering the south exit. The math was fine. The math had never been the concern. The product went to the 32nd Street facility, Dominic said. His voice had lost some of the rehearsed quality. Temporary hold, pending clarification of the arrangement. Call your father, Vincent said. Now, while I'm in this room. Dominic looked at him. Now, Vincent said. Not louder. Precisely the same volume, just without the space in it that left room for delay. Dominic made the call. The conversation lasted 4 minutes, most of it one-sided, most of the one side being Dominic's father's voice coming through the phone at a register that suggested the elder DeLuca had not, in fact, authorized his son's initiative. Dominic's face went through several phases during the 4 minutes, none of them comfortable. He hung up. The product will be returned to the original facility by morning, he said. Tonight, Vincent said. Another beat. Tonight, Dominic confirmed. Vincent looked at him for a moment longer than the confirmation required. Not to intimidate. The intimidation had already done its work. But because he wanted the kid to understand something that no one who worked for the DeLuca family had apparently told him. Your father built something that functions, Vincent said. Don't torch it to prove yourself to a room that's already watching. You don't have to earn your place with a stunt. You earn it by making things run. He held the kid's eyes. Think about that on the way back. He walked out. Caruso fell into step beside him through the warehouse. The adrenaline in the room was already diffusing. Men were moving differently, the specific loosening that came after a confrontation had resolved without escalation. Clean, Caruso said. For now. Vincent pushed through the door into the cold night air. Follow up in the morning. If the product isn't back by 6, I want to call immediately. He got in his car. It was 7:48. He drove. The coffee place was called something simple. A corner spot in Tribeca with large windows that made it visible from the street, warm light inside. The kind of neighborhood place that had been there long enough to have regulars. He parked 2 blocks away without planning to stop. He'd been telling himself he was just driving, just moving, just going in the general direction of the evening rather than toward anything specific. He saw them through the window. They were at a corner table. Nathan Brooks was leaning forward slightly, both hands around his cup, and his posture had the quality of someone who had said something significant and was giving it space to land. Charlotte was looking at her own cup, not away from him, not the polite deflection of someone who wasn't engaged, looking at her cup with the specific inward focus of someone thinking very hard about something that mattered. Vincent stopped on the sidewalk. He stood in the March dark with his hands in his coat pockets and watched through the glass the thing that he had built with 9 months of careful absence. The space in Charlotte's life that another person had walked into and was now occupying with honesty and attention and the basic dignity of a man who saw her value before it was convenient. He had no right to be angry. He was not angry. What he was, standing on that sidewalk with his breath going white in the cold, was the most clearly himself he'd felt in years, stripped of management, stripped of control, stripped of the organized distance he'd maintained so completely that it had become indistinguishable from who he was. He was a man who had made a catastrophic mistake and had spent too long making it and had started too late to understand what he'd done. Through the window, Charlotte raised her eyes from her cup. She looked at Nathan. She said something. He couldn't hear it. He couldn't read it. He watched Nathan receive it and watched what moved across Nathan's face. And what moved across Nathan's face was not the expression of a man receiving the answer he wanted. And Vincent felt his heart do something that was not quite hope because it was too frightened to be hope yet, but was something in the vicinity. Charlotte said something else. Nathan sat back. His hand moved across the table and he set it briefly over hers and then took it back. The gesture of someone accepting something with more grace than the situation required of them. Vincent turned away from the window. He walked back toward his car with the Tribeca street cold and specific around him and did not look back. Because looking back was not the move, and he had been making wrong moves for 9 months and was done with them. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from Charlotte's number. 5 words. "Are you still outside?" He stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at 5 words on a lit screen in the dark and felt the entire weight of the night. The warehouse, the lecture hall, the hallway at 5:30, the 3 letters in Eleanor's desk, 9 months of breakfast tables and turned-off porch lights, felt all of it arrive at once in the particular way that things arrived when they were real. He typed back, "Yes." He stood still. The coffee shop door opened behind him. He heard her footsteps on the sidewalk, specific and unhurried, getting closer, and he turned around and she was standing 6 feet away in the cold March night with her coat buttoned and her bag over her shoulder and an expression on her face that was not forgiveness and was not a verdict and was something more difficult than either of those things. "You watched us through the window," she said. "Yes." "And then you walked away." "Yes." She looked at him. "Why did you walk away?" He met her eyes. "Because it wasn't my window," he said. The street was very quiet around them. Charlotte looked at him for a long time in the cold with the coffee shop light behind her and the city doing its indifferent thing on all sides. And he held still under that look, because moving felt like the wrong thing, and he was done with wrong things, and he would stand on this sidewalk in this cold for however long it took her to finish reading what she said, "Come inside, it's cold." That was all. No verdict, no declaration, no signal about what the invitation meant beyond its literal content. She turned and walked back toward the coffee shop door, and he followed her because she'd asked him to, and because standing on that sidewalk alone was not something he was going to do when the alternative was being in the same room as her, whatever that room held. Nathan Brooks looked up when they came back in. He looked at Charlotte first, then at Vincent, and the specific quality of his reading of the situation was visible in his face. A man who was intelligent enough to understand immediately what he was looking at and decent enough not to perform anything about it. He stood. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "Brooks." They looked at each other across a small coffee shop table with Charlotte between them, in no physical sense but in every sense that mattered. And what passed between them in that look was not hostility and not competition. It was the specific acknowledgement of 2 people who understood the same situation from different positions and were both trying to handle it with more integrity than it strictly required. "I was just leaving," Nathan said. "You don't have to," Charlotte said. "I know." He picked up his jacket. He looked at Charlotte with the full attention he'd been giving her since the Sterling Gala in February. The real kind, And what was in that look was everything he'd come here to say and had apparently already said and had received an answer to that was sitting in his face with the particular grace of a man who had offered something genuine and been declined with equal genuineness. The Poughkeepsie letter. Take your time with it. The application deadline isn't until May. I'll have it to you by end of next week, Charlotte said. He nodded. He looked at Vincent one more time. Not a challenge, not a concession, just a clear-eyed accounting of the moment. And then he walked out. The coffee shop door closed behind him. Vincent stood beside the vacated chair and looked at Charlotte. Sit down, she said. He sat. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the table for a moment and then looked at him with the eyes that didn't deflect and said, He told me he had feelings for me. I know. And I told him I couldn't. She said it simply, without decoration, the way she said hard things. Not because of the marriage document. The document is still in process, and that's still true. But because... She stopped. She looked at her cup. When she looked back up, her eyes were very clear and very tired in the specific way of someone who had been doing difficult emotional work for months without reprieve. Because somewhere in the last 3 weeks, something started that I don't know what to do with yet. And I'm not going to start something with someone else while I don't know what to do with that. Vincent held still. I'm not telling you this is a reconciliation, she said. I'm telling you what's true. You said you wanted true. That's what true looks like from where I'm sitting. Okay, he said. Okay. The coffee shop moved around them. The specific ambient life of a neighborhood place in the evening, someone at the counter ordering, a couple near the window with their heads close together, the sound of a machine behind the bar producing something hot and complicated. Charlotte looked at him across the small table, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then she said, What happened tonight, before you showed up outside the window? He told her about Newark. Not the operational details, not the specifics of what the Callahan name moved through the world and what it cost to maintain that movement. She knew the broad shape of his life, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but he also wasn't going to read her into things she didn't need and hadn't asked for. He told her about the warehouse and Dominic DeLuca's bad idea and the 4 minutes of a phone call that had resolved it. And he told it without drama, the way he talked about work when work was going well, flatly, quickly, already past it. She listened. You came from Newark, she said. Yes. To stand outside a coffee shop window. I wasn't planning to stop. I was driving and... He stopped. He looked at her. I was going toward you. I've been going toward you for 3 weeks, and I don't have a better way to say it than that. Charlotte was quiet. I know it doesn't balance, he said. 9 months against 3 weeks. I'm not asking you to pretend it balances. Nothing balances it, she said, not cruelly, just accurately. That's not how it works. You don't get a scale. You don't put things on one side and things on the other and declare it even. She looked out the window at the street where he'd been standing. What happens is that the 9 months are permanent. They're in the past and they're real and they don't go away. And what happens alongside that is that the 3 weeks are also real. She looked back at him. Both things are true at the same time. That's the actual situation. He nodded. I need you to understand something, she said. The woman who set breakfast for 2 every morning for 8 months, she's still here. She didn't become someone else. But she made a decision in February, and that decision holds, which means I'm not going back to being invisible in my own life. If there's any version of something between us that happens from here, it happens between 2 people who are both actually present. And the moment it stops being that, I'm gone. Not angry, not dramatic, just gone. I understand. Tell me you actually understand. Not that you're agreeing with me to get what you want tonight. He looked at her steadily. I understand because I spent 5 hours today, a lecture hall and a warehouse and a sidewalk, feeling the specific cost of not understanding it for 9 months. That cost is in my body. It's not abstract. Charlotte looked at him for a long time. Outside the window, a cab went by, then a man walking a dog, then the ordinary Tuesday night current of the city. Okay, she said finally. She picked up her coat. Take me home, she said. They drove back to Westchester mostly in silence, but it was a different silence than the silences they'd built a marriage on. Those had been the silence of mutual avoidance, of two people generating as little contact as possible, of absence made companionable by duration. This silence had something in it: weight, consideration, the specific quality of two people who had said true things and were now sitting with what the true things meant. Charlotte watched the highway and then the river road, and then the familiar turn into Westchester, and she thought about Nathan's face when she'd told him. She'd told him gently, with the honesty he'd offered her, and deserved in return. He'd received it with a kind of quiet dignity that had made her feel both grateful and sad, because Nathan Brooks was a genuinely good person, and what she was turning away from was genuinely real. And the fact that she was turning away from it anyway told her something about what was happening in the 3-week category that she hadn't fully examined yet. She examined it now, in the passenger seat, with Vincent driving and the March dark on all sides, and the river invisible but present somewhere to their left. She was not ready to call it love. She was not sure what she was ready to call it. She knew it was real. She knew it had changed her in the last 3 weeks in some functional way, the way things changed you when they were actually happening to you, rather than to someone you were watching. She knew that the man driving was not the man who had walked out of their wedding ballroom, or rather, he was that man, carrying all of that man's damage and history, but he had cracked something open in himself, and she could see through the crack, and what she saw through the crack was someone she had not had access to before and could not simply dismiss. She was not going to confuse seeing someone with trusting them, but she was also not going to confuse 3 weeks of real change with the 9 months that preceded it. Both things true at the same time. Eleanor was still awake. This was not a surprise. Eleanor had been conducting vigils since before either of them was born and was not about to stop for a Tuesday. She was in the sitting room with a lamp and a book that she was not reading, and she looked up when they came in together, which was itself new information, and her face did something careful and private that she immediately controlled. "Tea," she said. "Maria left some." "I'll get it," Charlotte said. She went to the kitchen. Eleanor looked at Vincent. He sat down across from her in the chair where he'd sat when he found the letters, when the floor had gone somewhere he couldn't follow. "Well," Eleanor said, "she came home." Eleanor looked at him. "Not because she's forgiven me," he said. "She's been clear about that." "Good. She should be clear about that." "I know." Eleanor set her book down on the side table with the deliberate care of someone managing the fragility of their hands. She looked at him with 81 years of reading people in her face, and what she looked like was not triumphant, not relieved, something older than either, something that looked like the expression of a woman who had planted a seed years ago in very difficult ground and had waited with no certainty of outcome and was only now beginning to see whether it had taken. "What did you tell her tonight?" Eleanor said. "The true things." "All of them." "The ones that were mine to tell." Eleanor nodded slowly. "What about Nathan Brooks?" "He's gone," Vincent said, "with more grace than I deserved him to have." "He's a decent man." "Yes. She chose not to pursue it. She told me." He held his grandmother's gaze. "I know it wasn't because of me, Eleanor. I'm not taking credit for something she did entirely herself." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment with the specific expression she used when he said something that met her standard. It wasn't a warm expression. It was more like acknowledgement. From Eleanor Callahan, that was significant. Charlotte came back with 3 mugs and set them on the table and sat on the small sofa adjacent, the one that faced both chairs, and they sat in the sitting room, all 3 of them, for the first time in 10 months of shared household, and drank tea in the quiet. The following morning, Vincent was at the breakfast table when Charlotte came downstairs. This alone was not new. He'd been at the breakfast table for 3 weeks. What was new was the quality of being there, the particular absence of performance in it, the specific ease of a man who was present because the alternative was no longer available to him as a genuine option, rather than a man who was present because he was trying to demonstrate something. Charlotte poured coffee. She sat across from him. She looked at him over the rim of her mug. "I have a faculty meeting at 10, she said. "I'll be back around 4. "I moved my afternoon schedule," he said. "I'll be here." She nodded. She drank her coffee. "The divorce process," she said. "I'm going to put it on hold. Not withdraw. On hold." He looked at her. "That's different from what you think it means," she said. "It means I'm not closing the door. It does not mean I'm walking back through it. It means I'm standing in the frame for a while and seeing what the view looks like. I understand the difference. If you behave like you don't understand the difference, the door closes. That's not a threat, it's just information. I know. She set her mug down. She looked at him with the clear, direct, assessment quality look she'd been developing all her life and had spent 10 months applying to everything in the house except him, because applying it to him had cost more than she'd been able to afford. Why the lecture hall? She said. He considered it. He gave it the honest thought it deserved rather than the quick answer. Because I needed to see you in a place where I hadn't failed you, he said. Everything else, the kitchen, the library, the dining room, I could see what I'd done wrong in every corner of them. I needed to see you somewhere that was entirely yours and understand what that looked like, what you looked like, in a room that had only ever known the version of you that didn't have to manage around me. Charlotte was very still. And what did I look like? She said. Like yourself, he said. Like what you are when nobody's making you smaller. She was quiet for a long time. She stood up and rinsed her mug and picked up her bag and put her coat on. And at the door she turned back and looked at him across the kitchen the way she had that morning a week ago, the length of the room between them. That was the right answer, she said. She left. He sat alone in the kitchen, and the house settled around him, and he put both hands flat on the table and breathed. 3 weeks after that morning, on a Saturday with weather that had finally committed to spring in the way that April sometimes managed, Vincent Callahan asked Charlotte if she would drive somewhere with him. She said where? He said the Hudson Valley. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said yes. He drove. She sat in the passenger seat with the window down a few inches and the spring air coming through and her hair doing what it did in wind, which she kept attempting to manage and kept failing to. He didn't say anything about it. He drove, and she sat, and they moved north through the Saturday morning with the river opening up on their left and the ridgelines going green above them, the way they did when something had finally decided to change. She understood where they were going before they arrived. The estate sat at the end of its long drive, and in the spring light it looked different than it had in April of the previous year. Less formal, somehow. Or perhaps that was the light. Or perhaps it was simply that she was not arriving in Ivory with 200 strangers at her back, and a man waiting at an altar who had already decided not to know her. He parked. They sat in the car for a moment. "We don't have to go in," he said. "I know." She looked at the building. I want to." They went in. The estate ran a small events operation in the off-season, and the coordinator, a woman named Patricia, who recognized the Callahan name immediately and probably had opinions about this particular visit that she was professionally maintaining off her face, let them into the main ballroom without a fuss. She turned on a portion of the lights. Not the full event setting, just the working lights, which gave the room a stripped-down quality, the high ceiling visible, the floor plain and unadorned. Charlotte stood in the center of the room. Vincent stood 10 feet away and looked at her standing in the place where he had abandoned her. Not the same spot, probably. The room was large, but close enough. And the distance between where he was and where he should have been on that day was in the room with them like a third presence. She turned and looked at him. "Say what you brought me here to say," she said. He crossed the distance. He stopped in front of her with the working lights making the room honest and the spring afternoon on the other side of the windows, and nothing between them except the truth of the past 12 months. "I stood here a year ago," he said, "and I made a decision about you that I had no right to make and no information to support. And I used that decision to absent myself from a marriage and from a person in a way that I cannot account for, except by saying that I had organized my entire life around never being in a position where another person's absence could damage me. And I had done it so thoroughly that I preemptively made you into someone I didn't have to miss." He held her gaze. "That was a kind of cruelty," he said. "I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm telling you I know what it was." Charlotte looked at him. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was reading something very carefully. The stillness, the focus, the absence of defensive management. She was taking him in without buffer. "Every morning you set the table," he said. "Every note you left. Every night you turned that light on." His voice went rough at the edge and he let it. "I walked past all of it. and I told myself you were performing something, and I was right not to engage with it, and I was wrong. I was completely and specifically wrong. You were not performing. You were trying to build something with a man who had decided in advance not to let you. The ballroom was very quiet. The working lights made it plain and real. I don't know what we become from here, he said. That's yours to decide, and I mean that literally. You have the actual authority in this, not me. I've used up the version of authority that comes from never being vulnerable, and I'm not interested in operating that way anymore. He paused. But I want to be here, for whatever here looks like. I want to learn what you take in your coffee when it's actually cold outside versus when you're drinking it at your desk and it's already half gone. I want to argue with Eleanor alongside you instead of watching from the other side of the door. I want to sit in the back of your lectures and feel proud in a way that has nothing to do with me. He stopped. Something in his chest was working hard. I want to be your husband. Not on paper. Actually, your husband. And I know the only way to get there is one morning at a time, and you're not going to make it easy, and you shouldn't. Charlotte stood in front of him in the plain light of the empty ballroom. She stood there for a long time. You're right that I'm not going to make it easy, she said. I know. And I'm still angry, she said. I want you to know that. Underneath all the whatever this is, there's still a woman who ate breakfast alone for 8 months, and I'm not done being angry about that. I know. And the anger and this can both be true at the same time. Both things true, he said. Yes. She looked at him. She reached out and straightened his jacket collar. Not tenderly, exactly, more with the pragmatic directness of someone doing a small physical thing because words had run into their limit. Her fingers on the lapel and then gone. Take me to lunch, she said. Where? Somewhere with real food and bad service. I've had enough of things being smooth. He almost smiled. I know a place. Good. She looked around the ballroom one last time, taking it in, setting it in some internal record, filing it in the place you filed things that had happened and were finished with being only painful. Then she looked at him. Let's go. They walked out of the ballroom together. The months that followed were not easy, because Charlotte had been clear that they wouldn't be, and she was a woman who meant what she said. The anger she'd named in the ballroom appeared on certain evenings without warning. Not explosions, not cruelty, just the sudden presence of something real that she didn't pretend away. She'd go quiet at dinner sometimes, or she'd be working in the library, and he'd come to the doorway, and she'd look at him with an expression that was not hostile, but was not warm either. That was the look of someone doing ongoing accounting of a very large debt. And he would ask if she needed anything, and she would say no, and he would leave her to it. He stayed. That was the whole of it. He stayed, and he was present, and he did not make her anger a problem to be managed or a crisis to be resolved. He let it be what it was, the legitimate and ongoing consequence of things that had actually happened. He learned the difference between her anger and her retreat. The first was active, had heat in it, was her still engaged enough to feel. The second was the hollow quiet she'd worn for most of 8 months, and that appeared less and less as the spring moved into summer. The retreat was the thing that told him how far there still was to go. The anger, he came to understand, was the signal that she was still in the room. He came home for dinner. Not every night. His life was what it was, and it required what it required, and she had never asked him to pretend otherwise. But most nights. And on the nights he couldn't, he called, which was a thing he hadn't done in 10 months of marriage because calling required acknowledging that he was somewhere other than with a person who might notice his absence. She answered. Not every time, not warmly every time, but she answered. Danny graduated in May with the environmental science degree, and the ceremony was in the afternoon on a campus green, and the whole family came, which meant the full scope of Callahan assembled, uncles and cousins and their associated partners, the complex web of loyalty and history that made up the family's civilian face. Charlotte was there. She'd been there for the Sunday dinners since January. She'd been there in the way she'd been before, warm with Danny, engaged with the cousins who sought her out, careful with the uncles, Eleanor's clear favorite. But there was a difference now in how the family received her presence. A year ago, she'd been someone they were politely accepting because Eleanor wanted it. Now she was someone they'd watched, over 12 months, hold herself together in a situation that would have broken a lot of people, and the family's respect for endurance was genuine, even if it was rarely spoken. After the ceremony, Danny found her on the green and hugged her with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a 20-year-old who had just finished something difficult and needed to express it physically. "The watershed paper you sent in March," he said into her shoulder. "I cited it in my thesis." "I know," she said. "Your advisor emailed me." He pulled back and looked at her with the open gratitude that he hadn't learned yet to make subtle. "Thank you for all of it, since the beginning." "You did the work," she said. "I just told you it mattered." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was too earnest to be comfortable and too true to be embarrassing. "You also fixed our family," he said. "Danny? I'm serious. You didn't break it. It was already broken, but you—" He looked for the word. "You stayed when you didn't have to." And something about that made people start staying in other ways. Charlotte looked at him. She didn't have a response for that wasn't going to cost her more than she wanted to spend at a graduation party on a May afternoon. "Go find your mother," she said. He went. She stood on the campus green in the spring light and thought about staying. About what staying looked like when staying had not been guaranteed and was not easy and had not paid out in the obvious ways. About the specific weight of a decision you made, not because it was working, but because you hadn't yet arrived at the morning when you were certain it was over. She thought about all the mornings she hadn't been certain. She thought about the morning in February when she'd turned the porch light off, and the specific quality of putting her hand on that switch, the finality of it, the way it had felt like setting something down that she'd been carrying past its useful weight. She thought about the fact that the light was back on. She'd turned it on again sometime in late March without examining why, and it had stayed on, and neither of them had said anything about it. Eleanor declined in June. It was not sudden. It had been coming for a long time, and Eleanor had been managing her awareness of it with the same directness she brought to everything. But the pace accelerated in June in the way that pace sometimes did, and the household reorganized itself around what Eleanor needed with the practical love of people who'd had a long time to prepare and were still not prepared. Charlotte slept at St. Catherine's twice in that month, not because Eleanor asked her to, because Charlotte was a person who, when someone she loved was moving towards something final, could not be anywhere else. She sat with Eleanor in the nights when Eleanor didn't sleep, and they talked and sometimes didn't talk, and Charlotte read to her from a book on Hudson River painting that Eleanor had opinions about, even at 2 a.m. with an oxygen cannula and hands that shook. Vincent came every evening. He sat on the other side of Eleanor's bed and held his grandmother's hand with the gentleness of a large man who had learned, late, that gentleness was not a diminishment. One night near the end of June, Eleanor looked from Charlotte to Vincent and then back and said with the dry precision she maintained to the last, "You two look like you finally figured out how to be in the same room." "We're working on it," Charlotte said. "Don't work on it." Eleanor's voice was thin but exact. "Just do it. Working on things is how people avoid doing them." Charlotte met Vincent's eyes across the bed. Something moved between them that wasn't quite a smile. Eleanor closed her eyes. "The fig tart," she said, "at Christmas." "Yes. Make it for him sometime. You're not supposed to give him orders on my behalf. I'm 81, and I have an oxygen tank. I give whatever orders I like." Charlotte put her hand over Eleanor's. "Okay," she said. Eleanor died on the 1st of July, in the morning, in the particular way that people went when they had decided they were finished, quietly, without the drama that bodies sometimes imposed, simply stopping in the way that long things eventually stopped. Charlotte was there. Vincent was there. The room was full of the specific silence that followed something that had been a long time coming and was still, when it arrived, absolute. They buried Eleanor in the family plot in the Hudson Valley 4 days later in the heat that July brought in without apology. The service was simple by the family's standards, Eleanor had specified, and Eleanor's specifications were honored. A minister she'd liked, a reading she'd chosen, No performance of grief that she hadn't sanctioned. Charlotte stood beside Vincent through all of it, not holding his hand, standing beside him. The specific proximity of two people who had arrived at the understanding that being beside someone was different from being merged with them. That presence didn't require demonstration, that the most honest thing you could offer a person at their worst was simply to be somewhere they could find you without having to look far. At the reception afterward, in the Hudson Valley house that the family maintained for occasions, Danny found Charlotte by the window and stood beside her, and they didn't talk for a while. "She loved you," Danny said eventually. "I know." Charlotte looked at the grounds, the old trees, the river visible at the property's edge. "I loved her. She got what she wanted. She got more than she thought she was asking for." Danny looked at her. "Is that a complaint?" he said. Charlotte considered. "No," she said. "It's just true sex." On a Saturday in September, Charlotte made the fig and walnut tart. She didn't announce it. She simply made it, the way she did things, practically, without ceremony, with the Italian cookbook open on the counter and the specific focused attention of someone who was doing a task that mattered and wasn't going to perform the mattering. Vincent came into the kitchen while she was working and stopped in the doorway the way he had in February of the previous year, when the library had been her territory and he'd come for a catalog. "What is that?" he said. "Fig and walnut tart. Eleanor's mother's recipe, approximately." She didn't look up from the pastry. "It needs another 20 minutes. He came and stood at the counter at the appropriate distance and watched her work, and she let him, which was new. She'd been protective of the kitchen for a long time, protective of the spaces where she did things that were hers, not from hostility, but from the self-preservation of someone who'd learned that offering things that weren't received was its own kind of slow damage. Letting him watch was a different thing. It was the specific act of allowing someone into an unguarded space and trusting that the space would still be yours on the other side. He poured 2 glasses of something and set one near her without asking. She picked it up without comment. When the tart came out, she sliced it and put a piece in front of him at the kitchen table and sat across from him and watched him take the first bite. He went still. Not the polished reaction of someone acknowledging a thing was good. Something more private. He looked at the tart and then out the kitchen window, and his jaw was working slightly, and she understood, watching him, that he was doing with this bite something similar to what Eleanor had done at Christmas, going somewhere briefly that no one else had access to. The specific interior geography of something tasted that carried more than taste. He looked at her. "Eleanor's Christmas," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "She would have said it still needs something," he said. "She would have been specific about what." "And incorrect." Charlotte looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved. It was not a large movement. It was not the full laugh, the one that didn't wait for permission. It was the third laugh, the smallest one, the private one, the one she made when something surprised her into feeling something she hadn't been prepared to feel. He saw it. He didn't say anything about it. He ate the tart. They sat in the kitchen in the September afternoon with the light coming through the windows at the long end-of-season angle that made everything look more specific than usual, and outside the grounds were doing what they did in early fall. The first color at the edges, the particular quality of air that carried the summer going out of it, and the Callahan mansion settled around them with the specific sound of a house in which something had changed, not healed, changed. There was a difference. Healing suggested return to a prior condition, and the prior condition had not been good. What they were moving toward was not a restoration, but a construction, something being built out of the materials the last 12 months had left, which were not clean materials, were in fact the rubble of a marriage that had been mishandled from its first hour, but which included also the letters Charlotte had written, and the breakfast she had made, and the light she had turned on and on again, and the 3 weeks of mornings that had become 4 months of mornings, and the ballroom in April, and Eleanor's fig tart at Christmas, and a man learning to stay. Charlotte set her fork down. She looked at Vincent across the table. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'm going to look at the Poughkeepsie property again. Nathan's firm got the grant. They want archival support for the restoration documentation." She held his gaze. "I'm going to be working with Nathan. I need you to be fine with that. I'm fine with that. I need you to be actually fine, not managed fine. He looked at her. He's a good architect, Vincent said. And you make better decisions about what to preserve when someone qualified is pushing back on you. I don't have to like it, and I'm actually fine with it. Charlotte looked at him for a moment. That was the right answer again, she said. I'm improving. Don't get ahead of yourself. He picked up his glass, she picked up hers. They sat in the kitchen in the September light and drank, and outside New York moved at its relentless pace, and somewhere in the world the Callahan name continued to mean what it had always meant in the rooms where it mattered. And inside this kitchen, two people who had nearly missed each other entirely were building something one ordinary afternoon at a time, without guarantees, without the pretense that the past was not what it was, with only the specific and sufficient commitment of two people choosing to remain in the same room and mean it. The tart was gone. The light moved. The kitchen held them.